We are live from Books and Books here in Coral Gables, Florida. We thank you so much for being here. To our internet audience watching, if at any time during tonight's presentation you'd like to order a copy of the book, you may do so by calling the number on your screen. You can give us a call here at the store. We'll get a book signed for you, and we'll ship it to you free of charge for the shipping anywhere here in the United States. For those of you here, I ask you to please silence your cell phones. And don't forget to visit us online at booksandbooks.com. We'll give you a breakdown of all the wonderful events we have here at Books and Books. Just about every night of the week, we have about 60 events every month. You can pick up a copy of our Books and Books newsletter as well on the counter. That'll give you a breakdown as well. When you're at our site, give us your email so we can keep you apprised of everything that goes on at all of our locations here, Miami Beach, the Bal Harbor shops, and we also have a new store down at the Arch Center downtown. And we also archive all of our live streamed events, as we are this one this evening. So if you want to watch it again, you may do so by logging into our account at booksandbooks.com. Click on the link, and you can also visit us on Facebook and Twitter. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us Ms. Jennifer Steil, and she is an award-winning American writer, a journalist, and actor. She's currently living in La Paz, Bolivia. Her first book, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, is a memoir about her experiences as an editor of the Yemen Observer newspaper, and received accolades from the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Sydney Morning Herald, among many other publications. National Geographic Traveler actually includes this book as a recommended reading list. Jennifer's second book and debut novel, The Ambassador's Wife, has won the 2013 William Faulkner William Wisdom Creative Writing Competition Best Novel Award. She's currently working on two more novels, one set in New York and one in Bolivia. We've also just found out that The Ambassador's Wife is now going to be produced as a TV miniseries starring Anne Hathaway, so we're very excited for you for that. Jennifer's done book events all over the world. We're so glad to have her in our part of the world tonight. Please welcome Ms. Jennifer Steil.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm thrilled to be here at Books and Books. I love this bookstore, and every time I'm in town, I stop by. So thank you for taking time out of your busy lives and coming to see me. I really appreciate it. I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about how I came to write this particular novel. In 2006, I moved to Yemen to run a newspaper. I spent my first year in Yemen as the editor-in-chief of this newspaper, and it was such an interesting and challenging and somewhat hilarious year that I wrote a book about it. That book was my first book, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, which is a memoir. And that writing that memoir felt very much like a continuation of my journalism career. I've been a journalist for about 13 years before I took over the newspaper. And when I was writing the memoir, it felt very much like long-form journalism. You know, I had to do the same reporting and make sure that all my quotes were exactly right. And I had Al-Qaeda experts look over my section on Al-Qaeda. I had Arabists look over my transliteration of Arabic. And I was really painstaking with the research that went into that book. So by the time I was done writing that book, I was really tired of telling the truth. I just wanted the freedom to make things up and fabricate and caricature people I know and just have a really good time with writing. It seemed really freeing after having spent all this time making sure everything was accurate and true to the best of my knowledge. Also, around the time I was thinking about writing this book, I had just moved in with the man who is now my husband. He, at the time, was the British ambassador to Yemen. And I went from living in a Yemeni house in the old city of Sana'a, a very beautiful Yemeni house, but I was living alone in the old city. I was not with an organization or an embassy or anything like that. So I had the freedom to roam the country as I wanted. And I traveled all over and... Welcome. And when I moved in with Tim, when I moved into the British ambassador's residence, suddenly I was in this very strange world. We couldn't leave our house without bodyguards. We had Scotland Yard and hostage negotiators and British ministers in our guest bedrooms. We had the Yemeni foreign minister at our dinner table. We almost always had house guests because of the security situation in Yemen. A lot of the people who were coming from the UK to Yemen for work would stay with us. So we had some pretty fascinating dinner table discussions. And I heard so many great things that I kept thinking this would make a great book. But I didn't want to ruin my husband's career that early in our marriage. So I figured I'd better write something fictional. And I thought it would be interesting if I could take this very weird world in which I'm living and create a fictional narrative in that weird world. So I can use some of the funny details, but then create a fictional story. There were a couple of other things I was thinking about as I began writing. I'd just given birth to my daughter, so I was thinking about parenthood. And because I came to parenthood rather late, I was wondering if I would adopt a second child, or, you know, if my husband would want to adopt, and what if we disagreed about whether or not to adopt. You know, what would the effect be on a marriage if a child was just dropped on you and suddenly you had to make a decision about what to do with this child. I was also thinking a lot about the role of women in the Middle East, and also the role of Westerners in foreign cultures. When I first moved to Yemen, a Maltese woman I met said to me, "I'm so frustrated with all these Westerners who come to Yemen to free the women, or come to anywhere in the Middle East to free the women, without considering the culture or the context, you know, in which they were working." And, you know, you can't just tell women to throw off their veils or leave their husbands or abandon their families, because that has real effects. You can endanger women. You're also not considering what's important to them in their lives. And so when you go to a foreign culture, it's very important to listen and watch than it is to try to impose your values. And so I thought, what if I had a character who, you know, had good intentions, but kind of had tunnel vision and failed to consider the context in which she was working. And at the same time, I was thinking about, because when I ran the newspaper, half my staff were women, and they were feisty. And I feel like there's a perception in the West that Muslim women have no power. And I wanted to explore ways in which these women have a kind of power. They have the power of their family networks, which play a huge role in this book. They have the power of their connections with each other. They also have the power of anonymity, because their dress kind of keeps them from being recognized. It's slightly easier for them to sneak around. The ambassador in this book is the weakest character. This book starts out with, there's a British ambassador with an American wife, and that's where the similarity to real life ends. The American wife is a visual artist. She's a painter. And she was originally in the country with a girlfriend, and she began mentoring these Muslim women and teaching them how to paint and draw in ways that their culture frowned upon. So this was done very much in secret, and then she met her husband, the man who had become her husband. And they had a 13-month-old daughter when Miranda, the wife, is kidnapped. And that is the beginning of the book, is she's kidnapped, leaving behind a daughter. So the ambassador can't go after his wife, first of all, because the security situation means that he'd almost certainly be killed if he tried to find her. But also he has his daughter in his care, and he can't leave her without any parents, because he doesn't know if his wife is alive or dead. So I think that's enough to tell you at the start. I'm going to read 3 very brief selections, about 2 pages each. And then afterwards, I will take your questions. So the first section I'm going to read is about Miranda and her students, her art students. A single ray of sunlight streaming in through a tiny square cut into the roof of Miranda's diwan caught the dusty air, exposing the glittering powder with which the women filled their lungs. Atoms of stone exhaled centuries ago that had drifted out windows and down narrow passageways, in and out of mosques, in and out of Mazruki mouths, male and female, adult and child, believer and heretic, sharing breath. Miranda contemplated the light, the tumbling grit, tempted to draw out her own sketchbook. Pieces of the universe as old as God rained down on them. She sat on the floor at the end of the rectangular room, charcoal pencils and pastels fanned out in front of her. The women were still floating onto the cushions, abayas sinking down around them like parachutes, 2 on either side. Akila and Nadia on her left, Tazkia and Mariam on her right. Their faces were bare, niqabs flipped back over their heads. As Miranda shuffled through a stack of sketchbooks on her lap, they unzipped bags, curled their bare feet underneath them, and lifted their eyes to her, hopeful, wary, eager, anxious. They had been meeting for several weeks. Each time, the women were incrementally more relaxed, more confident, but it was slow. Their fears were too well-founded to be vanquished entirely. In her first class, as if to make sure Miranda understood what they risked, they had told her, in turns, interrupting each other in their imperfect English, the tale of Isla. Instinctively, the girls who doodled in the margins of their school notebooks were drawn to each other and formed a kind of protective secret society. Taskia, Akila, and Mariam had met as children, scribbling with their fingers in the dust of the alleys near their homes, until adult arms finally descended to restrain them. Nadia and Isla, who came from villages in the north, had moved to the city later as teenagers. Rarely did they meet all together, afraid of discovery. But in pairs they encouraged each other, rationalized away their sins, offered the comfort of shared guilt. Isla had been among the boldest, sketching caricatures of their teachers and friends, which she shared only with her fellow artists before tearing them into confetti or setting fire to them in an unpopulated alley. When her father discovered one such drawing on the back page of a textbook, he had taken Isla by the hand without speaking and led her to the room where her mother was ironing their sheets. "Go," he said to his wife. "I have a lesson to teach your daughter." As soon as the woman was out of sight, Isla's father had turned the iron on its side and stood behind the girl, holding her wrists. With slow deliberation, he had pressed her palms against the scorching metal. Her mother had responded immediately to her daughter's screams, but had been unable to pull her husband's arms away. Isla had been hospitalized with third-degree burns for 13 days before she died of septicemia. The story had a dampening effect on Miranda's professorial passion. While she hadn't been cavalier in inviting the women to study with her, she had insufficiently grasped the peril in which she placed them. Never had such responsibility been laid on her shoulders. Yet, here they were. 4 hungry souls gathered before her, their passion overwhelming their terror. Did this not have to be honored? Knowing what they dared, how could she not teach them? So that's the most traumatic scene in the book. So I've gotten that over for you now. The rest of it's lightness and joy. I'm going to read you a brief scene that takes place during Miranda's first morning in the ambassadorial residence, based on an actual incident. It looked just like a light switch, a small white plastic square set into the wall next to the bed. The room was dim, and Miranda was tired, so how was she to know? It was Thursday, the start of the Mizruki weekend, but Finn had gone into the embassy to finish up some work, leaving her slumbering. She had not woken up in this room very many times, and never alone. So when she slid from the sheets to stand, her sleepy fingers fumbled for the nearest switch and pushed. A short, piercing beep was the only response. The room stayed dark. That didn't bode well. She stood naked next to the bed, puzzled. But hearing no further noises, she made her way downstairs in search of lime juice. There was no point in getting dressed. She was alone in the house, and it was warm. Besides, there was something a little thrilling about walking naked down such an elegant staircase in a house usually bustling with overdressed people. Her cell phone rang before she was back upstairs. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" Finn, sounding out of breath, phoning from the embassy. "I'm fine," she said, setting the glass of pale green juice down on the table next to the bed before she spilled it. "Why?" "One of the house panic alarms has gone off." "Oh, no." Her stomach started to curl into itself. "Did you hit an alarm?" "Well, It looked just like a light switch. She wondered how much trouble she was in. Well, Tucker is on his way over to reset the alarm, so let him in. Probably useful for you to know anyway. I'm really sorry, but you might have mentioned it was an alarm. It just looked so much like it's all right. But 6 armed men are about to break down the front door, so you might want to get downstairs. Oh, God, I'm not dressed. Just then, the house phone began to ring, and she heard a pounding on the front door. I have to go. 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 They're just going to want to check the house, so let them do that. Okay. Okay, shit, I'm really sorry. She put the phone down and reached for the closest thing she could find to put on, a green Indian blouse and black skirt left on an armchair. Pulling the blouse over her belly as she ran down the stairs, she reached the bottom just as the front door flew open and several dark men with machine guns stormed the front hall. Immediately, they moved toward the living room and kitchen, their eyes searching the upstairs balcony for intruders. A rosy-cheeked British man with short-cropped blonde hair led the team of invaders. This must be Tucker. She hadn't met him yet. He had arrived in Mazruk only recently to take over the training of Finn's close protection team. Hell of a way to introduce herself. Her clothes wrinkled and twisted around her body, her corkscrew curls standing out from her head in every direction, her face still creased from sleep, and obviously too dim-witted to know what a panic button was. She had so hoped that they'd get along. I'm so sorry, she said. I'm afraid this is all my fault. No worries. Tucker smiled at her, his blue eyes still glancing around the house. At least this way I finally get to meet you. You must be Mira. How did you guess? Tucker. He shook her hand before continuing. Actually, we've never tested that particular button, so now at least we know it works. Looks that way. We just have to check the house anyway, he said, in case there's someone in here making you say things. Okay, she said, feeling incredibly foolish. Go ahead. Not that anyone was waiting for her permission. He ran upstairs, and she apologized to the CP team as well, in her halting Arabic. They were kind, saying, Mafish mishkala, no problem, before going off to search the corners of the house for terrorists. She sat down at the bottom of the long marble staircase, her head in her hands. She obviously wasn't quite prepared for her new life. Of course, her new life hadn't really quite started. She was still in between lives, in between homes, in between security regulations. And in Finn's life, she didn't officially exist. So that was her first day being an ambassador's wife. This is two more things I want to say before I read the last section. One of the other issues that was on my mind is that when I met my husband, I was a very independent person with a career of my own. I'd been a journalist for many years. I'd always lived alone. And when I was introduced to people, I was introduced as, this is Jennifer, she's a writer, or this is Jennifer, she's a journalist, or something like that. And then as soon as I moved in with Tim, it was, this is Jennifer, or she's the ambassador's wife. She's Tim's wife. And suddenly I ceased to become a person of my own, and I was just somebody's sidekick. And I chafed against this because I was like, I'm also a person in my own right. I mean, I loved being Tim's wife. I still do. But I also am a person with my own career. And so Miranda has kind of similar issues in it because she's been an artist her whole life. And so it's a real adjustment to go from having her own priorities and her own career and a free life to being in this constrained environment and being introduced as simply someone's wife. And there's nothing wrong with that, but she also wanted people to know she was an artist because that's her identity is wrapped up in being an artist, like my identity is wrapped up in being a writer. So there's identity issues there. And the other thing I wanted to say, the last section I'm going to read takes place when Miranda's in captivity. And as I mentioned, when she's taken hostage in the beginning of the book, she leaves behind her daughter. And when she was taken captive, she was still breastfeeding. So she has milk, and that's important to know. Well, you'll pick it up anyway. But the other thing I wanted to mention about when I was talking about the inspirations for the book is, although most of this book is totally fictional. The scene in which Miranda is taken hostage is pretty close to what happened when I was taken hostage in Yemen when I was 6.5 months pregnant. And I was very lucky, and I was only held for an afternoon. So, but it was a fairly terrifying afternoon. So that kind of helped give me a place to start the story. Okay, I'm going to read this section from Miranda in Captivity. And the woman who's in charge of watching over her is named Aisha. And Aisha has just brought Miranda a clean shirt to put on. She holds out the soggy shirt to Aisha. "Milk," she says. "I have a baby at home." Perhaps this information will encourage leniency. Surely a woman would understand what it means to be separated from a child. Aisha stares for a moment and then reaches her left hand toward the shirt. She pinches it and lets it drop. "Milk," she says. "Son or daughter?" "A daughter." Miranda isn't sure she should be giving this information away, but she cannot think of anything else to say. She pulls the jersey over her head. The woman clucks again in disapproval. "Maybe next time you will have a son," she says. Miranda bites back in instinctual defense of her daughter. When she was pregnant, the guards had constantly blessed her belly, wishing her a boy. But Miranda had wanted a girl for as long as she wanted a child at all. After the amniocentesis in London, when she and Finn told the guards they were definitely having a girl, the men still resisted the idea. This is not a country that rejoices in the birth of girls. "Inshallah, it will be a boy," they repeated. Miranda and Finn tried to explain that they already knew the child's sex, but this just confused the men. Finally, Miranda gave up, though she could never resist saying, "But I don't want a boy. I want a girl." It was important to her that they know that somewhere, by someone, girls were wanted. Aisha adjusts her niqab one more time and disappears. Miranda assumes she's gone to fetch her something else to wear, but when the woman returns a few hours later, she is carrying a tiny parcel wrapped in a dirty pink blanket. "You feed," she says. "Feed her." She thrusts the blanket toward Miranda, who gingerly takes it in her hands. It weighs almost nothing. In the dim light, it takes her a second to discern the top of a tiny head covered with fine black hair. Kneeling, Miranda lays the baby on the floor in front of her and slowly peels back the blanket. Nausea wrings her stomach when she sees the tiny infant. Its ribs are clearly visible, propping up the skin like tent poles, its arms and legs wasted almost to bone. Its stomach is bloated and round. Miranda slips a finger around the edge of the filthy piece of cloth pinned at the tiny hips. A girl. The child watches her with large, dark eyes, quiet. She doesn't have the energy to cry, Miranda thinks. It may be too late. Aisha is watching her impatiently. She flips the blanket closed again, covering the child's shriveled form. "Feed," she says again. "Where's her mother?" "Mayita, dead." "And her father?" "They were both killed, government bombs." "She has no one?" "No one is left." Miranda lifts the feather-light child, shifting her into her left arm as she lifts her shirt with her right hand. Queasiness at her disloyalty almost overwhelms her. But chubby little Cressida doesn't need this anymore, even if she could get it to her. She presses the child's face to her nipple, but the tiny girl doesn't drink. She simply continues to stare up at Miranda, her cracked lips slightly open. "What has she been eating?" asks Miranda, stroking the girl's cheek. "Tea." "Tea? That's all we have to give her." Carefully, Miranda takes her nipple between her fingers, holds it over the child's lips, and squeezes gently. A few drops of watery milk spatter onto the girl's lips. A tiny tongue darts out searchingly. The taste is sweet. She opens her mouth wider. Miranda squeezes more milk into her mouth. For nearly an hour, she repeats this, alternating breaths and continuing to try to get the child to suck. She licks her own finger to clean it and gives it to the girl to suck and then transfers her to the nipple. The child doesn't have the strength to nurse for more than a few seconds, but Miranda is patient. Her body relaxes as her breasts are slowly relieved of their stores. She does all of this mechanically, trying to calculate its significance. If her captors need her to feed this child, surely they won't kill her now. Is this girl her salvation? But before this morning, they hadn't known she was breastfeeding, hadn't known about Cressida. So why have they spared her? Aisha watches for a while before beginning her morning prayers, prostrating herself on the dirt floor. Miranda wonders how old the child is. She doesn't even know her name. She waits for Aisha to finish her prayers before she asks. Aisha isn't sure of the girl's age. No one here is ever sure about anyone's age, but thinks she's not more than a few weeks old. She has no name, or rather, no one knows her name. But Aisha had passed by the ruins of her house and heard the crying. The child had been lying under an inverted V of mud bricks, surrounded by splintered plaster and stone. I could not just leave her there when Allah had spared her, she says, though we have nothing to give her. The women left here are either too old or too young to have milk. The girl had been staying with one of Aisha's sisters, who fed her tea. I don't have enough milk for a newborn, Miranda thinks. Perhaps her body will adjust to the child's needs, but she has no idea. Aisha squats, anxiously watching Miranda. The frail child has fallen asleep in her arms. Miranda rewraps her in the dirty blanket and places her on the mat. They had swaddled Cressida until she was 3 months old and could wrestle her arms and legs out of her blankets, like the Incredible Hulk, Miranda had said. Finn had looked at her questioningly, another cryptic pop culture reference. Aisha stands. Hasna, now we get the water. But the child, Miranda starts. The woman nods and disappears into one of the other houses. When she returns, she carries a long bolt of red and black striped cloth. Together, they fashion a sling so that Miranda can carry the infant close to her chest. Miranda pays close attention to the way Aisha folds it. To think she had paid nearly $50 for a custom-made sling for Cressida. That amount of money seems ludicrous to her now. The baby smells faintly of fecal matter, though Miranda imagines it has been a long time since she consumed enough calories to trigger a bowel movement. Miranda is surprised to find herself trusted with the infant. Aisha could just as easily have carried her, but she seems to have abdicated responsibility. The girl sleeps all the way to the spring and back, exhausted from her efforts to nurse. When the water is stashed by the fire and the women have settled on the ground to eat their beans again, the baby opens her eyes and lets out a feeble howl of hunger. Well, that's a good sign, whispers Miranda, setting aside her tin plate and picking up the child. Let's try this again, shall we? And that baby plays a very pivotal role in the plot of the book and the bond Miranda forms with her. Now I would love to answer any questions you might have about the book, about the writing process, about Yemen, about diplomatic life, being held hostage, anything, any questions? Must be something you're curious about.
Why do you live in Bolivia now?
Why do I live in Bolivia? My husband is now the European Union ambassador to Bolivia. So it was his job that took us there. And it's a great place to be a writer. Everywhere is a great place to be a writer. And it's nice that we get to switch countries every 3 or 4 years. So I have somewhere new to write about. Yeah. Yes?
Why did you go to Yemen to begin with? Of every place, even in the Middle East, why Yemen?
Well, I actually had no intention of moving to the Middle East. I was working for a news magazine in New York, and pretty happily. And I got an email from my high school boyfriend who said that he'd been doing a little bit of writing for this Yemeni newspaper, but that the journalists had no training, and they were desperate for training, and there was no one there who could help them, and would I come over and train them? And so I wrote back and said, well, I can't just give up my job in New York and my health insurance and run off to Yemen, but I've got 3 weeks vacation, so I could come teach a training course to the journalists if you think that would be useful. So the owner of the paper said, sure, that'd be great. So I went to Yemen, taught a 3-week training course to the journalists at this newspaper, and had just an amazing 3 weeks. I mean, the journalists there treated me like visiting royalty, and they just could not have been more hospitable or warmer or more embracing, and also more anxious to learn. I've never taught anyone who was so desperate for knowledge as these Yemeni reporters. And after 3 weeks, I realized, that we'd barely scratched the tip of the iceberg. And if I really wanted to help them in any lasting way, I'd have to stay longer. And it was around that time that the owner of the paper said, I love what you're doing with my staff and with the paper. Would you take over the paper and turn it into the New York Times? And I said, frankly, I'm not qualified to do that. I've never managed a paper. I've never written for the New York Times, and I'm not sure I could live on $12,000 a year. And he said, sure you could. You could here, which was true. You can live on $12,000 a year, live like a king, and save at least $5,000 of that, because it's impossible to spend money in Yemen, or it was. There's been quite a bit of inflation since then. But anyway, so I wasn't sure I wanted to make such a dramatic move. So I went back to New York, but almost as soon as I walked back into my office in Manhattan, I thought, okay, I could spend the next 15 years walking into the same gray carpeted newsroom, or I could do something really interesting with my life. And if I move to Yemen and it turns out I can't handle running a newspaper and it's total chaos, then maybe I could write a book about it, which is ultimately what I did. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes. Yes, I have kept in touch with them. I've kept in touch with every single one except one person. They're all still alive, thank goodness. Two of my women, my star reporter, was a Yemeni woman who was just wonderful and brilliant, and ended up doing some reporting for the New York Times, actually, and El País in Spain as well. She ended up marrying a human rights lawyer, and he got death threats, and they fled to Turkey. And she's also working for UNDP there at the moment. So she just has a 6-month visa, and I'm not sure what will happen to her after that. But I'm in touch with her all the time. I mean, she's probably one of my closest and dearest friends. I ended up being in Yemen for 4 years. So, I mean, for example, before she left Yemen, when things were really bad, she rang me up on Skype in Bolivia and said, if anything happens, will you take my son? And I was like, I burst into tears when she said that. But I mean, I would, but I can't legally take her son, But, that kind of tells you the extent of our relationship. And another one of my reporters married a man who got a scholarship to Germany, so they're in Germany. But the rest of them are pretty much all still in Yemen, including, my friends from my old neighborhood. There were the Saudis bombed buildings right next to where I used to live. And now people are being kidnapped in the places I walked through every single day. I walked an hour to work and back every day, and nothing ever happened to me. And now it's become more of a regular occurrence. Yes.
Where do you, of all the places you've lived, where do you think you've seen since living there the most progress, perhaps, since you started your journey of writing and training, and as far as progress for women is concerned, or women maybe in other countries who wanted to become writers or who wanted to take a similar path to yours for journalism?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I've seen. I mean, there was some progress in Yemen in 2011. There was a peaceful revolution at that time, where they had thousands and thousands of people in what they called Change Square, and they all left their weapons outside of this square. And it was the first time a lot of women had participated in public life in any way. Women never really participated in public life, in political life, and they were. Some of them were taking workshops on how democracy worked and taking literacy workshops for the first time. And there were all these exciting things happen. None of this got reported for some reason, but that's generally because no Western newspaper has reporters there. Yeah, it's yeah.
You're the negative side of it.
I mean, I do read the news reports on Yemen, but I really don't, it's hard to believe any of them because no one has reporters in the country. And Yemen is an extremely complicated country. I lived there 4 years and feel like I just understand the surface of the many layers of the culture and the politics, which are extremely complicated. And so just for reporters to think they can accurately cover the country from abroad is insane. Well, Bolivia, feels like a is far more developed than Yemen, and women have more rights. However, there are problems with alcoholism, and domestic abuse is kind of rampant in Yemen. And I hear a lot of stories on a personal level from people I know. A friend of mine was her ex-husband, or rather the man she's trying to divorce, threatened to kill her in front of their 4-year-old, and she reported it to the police, and they gave her a sanity test. Because if you're going to report your husband threatening your life, then clearly you're insane. So I think women's rights has a long way to go. I mean, that's one of the things diplomats try to encourage. The EU has a million different projects there. I mean, a million is not the exact number, but they have a lot of different projects, and they've got water projects. And one of the projects my husband is working on is trying to reform the judicial system, which is corrupt all the way from the police on up. And for example, if a woman is raped, you would never report it. Never. There'd be no point, because you'd have to pay the police for them to write a report, and then chances are you'd get locked up and not the man. So it's kind of that kind of society. But women are freer than they are in Yemen, and that you can wear whatever you want. There aren't the same kind of social pressures, and it's much more of a developed country. I don't know the education statistics offhand, but more Yemeni women are educated. I mean, more Bolivian. Sorry, I get confused. But more Bolivian women are educated, whereas only about half of Yemeni women, or half to 70%, are illiterate. So,
how has your understanding of the diplomatic world changed since you've got so much closer to it, if it has at all?
Yeah, dramatically. I mean, I had no idea what diplomats did really before I moved in with my husband. I thought ambassador was just kind of a fancy title, and you just went to parties. And I quickly found out this was really not true. I mean, to be an ambassador requires, I can't even believe there are political appointees, because it's a job that requires decades of experience before you become an ambassador. I mean, you have to know everything about development, everything about politics. You need to know the language of where you're going. It's really important, especially in the Middle East. And it makes me insane when Western governments send people who don't speak Arabic to the Middle East. I'm just like, what are you thinking? Our relationship with this part of the world is really important. And, if you value that relationship at all, you've got to send someone who knows the language. There's so many different things that my husband does that my 5-year-old really has no idea what he does for a living, because it would take us so long to explain. But, he oversees a lot of development projects. There's a lot of rivers in Bolivia that have the pH of, some rivers in Bolivia. I mean, I won't say a lot, but some rivers that have the pH of battery acid that feed into these lakes where people fish from. So, there's a lot of water projects. There's some farming projects. There's the judicial system. So there's just such a broad range of things that they work on. And they also, all the European Union ambassadors come to our, the French, the British, the Italian ambassadors come to our house every month and talk about what issues they want to bring up with the Bolivian government and what kind of political pressure they might want to put on them. So I've learned kind of a million things. I mean, one of the things I love about being married to my husband, other than I love him as a human being, is that his job and his career is fascinating to me. And I learn things every single day from him and from the people that we're surrounded by. And I learn a lot about our host countries. I learn new languages. I didn't speak Spanish before we moved to Bolivia, so I had to learn in a hurry. It's certainly, there's tons of stuff I still haven't even learned. But I mean, it's not a cushy job. I mean, we get up at 6:30, and then my husband goes off to work, comes home at 7 to help me put my daughter to bed. Then he's got events pretty much 5 evenings a week. And then often he'll come home from an event at 11 and work till 3 in the morning. So he doesn't get a lot of sleep when he's working in post. So yeah, it's a much more difficult and sensitive job than I ever imagined, I think, before I was in it.
Do you think that you'll ever, your child will be raised there or here?
I don't think we'll live in the U.S. anytime soon. She's lived in 4 countries so far. She speaks 3 languages, and she's 5. Our permanent home is in France. We just bought a house there. So we wanted to do that so she'd have somewhere that was permanent, because it's going to be sad for her when we leave Bolivia. I mean, that's her home. And we don't know yet if Tim will get another posting or not, so we'll just see. And we don't know where that would be.
Well, that would be rare.
Usually, we'll finish the post in Bolivia at the end of August, but if he had another posting with the EU, it would start the 1st of September. So there really wouldn't be much time between posts. Yeah. Are we running out of time? Okay.
Other questions? These are great questions. Yeah. Yes, Margie.
Why did you make her a visual artist?
Good question. I made her a visual artist, first of all, because I certainly didn't want to write about a writer. I find that dull when writers write about other writers. And also, I find that I'm not naturally a visual writer. I'm not naturally a visual thinker. And so I wanted to create a character who would force me to think differently and to write differently. So I made her an artist so that I could try to see the world the way she sees it. I spend some time at artist residencies, often working alongside visual artists, and I always find them hugely inspirational because they think so differently from the way that I think. And I love it. I love being around visual artists. It's great to see the world through their eyes. And I thought that would be fun to do with Miranda, and maybe make it kind of a more kind of visual book. So, yeah.
Anything else? Yes.
We're in France, usually.
In the south, near the Cevennes Mountains, kind of in the Gard, north of Montpellier. So it's affordable. Yeah, I mean, you can get, yeah, and it's in that part of France, you can get a house for 200,000 euros, where you can't buy a studio apartment in Manhattan for that. And if I were going to buy property in the U.S., I would probably buy something in New York, because that's my home in the U.S., but I can't afford it. So in France, you can get a whole house for that kind of money. And my husband's always wanted to live in France, and it was the one language that I actually studied the longest, and I love the country. So, yeah. And
If he just stays at the EU.
Not commuting distance, but
for weekends. So right now it's really hard to get there at all, because it takes 30 hours, including the time between flights, to get from Bolivia to France, and it's a nightmare of a journey. So you have to wait enough time so you forget how awful it is before you do it again. And it's also really expensive. So, we can't go more than once a year from Bolivia. So it'd be nice if we had a posting closer, but that may or may not happen. So, but eventually he'll retire in 7 years, and then we'll be permanently in France. Unless I get a job somewhere else, in which case my husband has promised to follow me. So, although I did explain to him that our standard of living would drop considerably. So, yes.
After writing books, would you ever consider going back to an office job?
I'd consider going back to journalism, certainly. And I might have to go back to a full-time job. It depends on how well this book does. And, how things sort out with my husband's retirement. But, right now we need both of our incomes, and I don't plan to retire ever from writing books. But I would be happy to go back to journalism, depending on what job it was. I still do some freelance writing. I've written a bunch of stories recently, a lot of personal essays, which I like doing, although you can't make a living writing personal essays. So.
Do you have a blog too?
I do. I had this illusion that I was going to blog my book tour, and I made 2 entries in my first week, and then things got crazy. So, but I've been writing some notes, so I think, yes, I will eventually put that on my website.
of which?
I'm sorry.
It's on my website, so it's jennifersteil.net, and there's a little blog thing on the menu bar. And there's only like 2 entries there. But something else I'm doing also on my website is interviewing other authors. And I've just started doing that. So there's 2 interviews up, but I've got like the next 7 authors lined up. I just need time to send them the questions. So once this travel bit is over, I've got a lot of work to do. So
You never know, because I've seen authors that start out with a blog and they end up with a book deal, and I'm going, it's amazing.
You can start with those like web series, like Seinfeld has, like riding in cars with comedians with coffee or something like that. He has this like web series. So yeah, where he interviews other comedians in cars drinking coffee. So all you do is come up with a gimmick, except you're in different countries, I imagine, than the authors you're interviewing. But anyway,
So
they
they
turn
do
it into like some kind of a webcast, audiocast.
Skype conversations.
Skyping with authors.
Have you ever heard of Catherine Saunderson? She has a blog entitled Petit Anglais.
Oh,
And
great.
a number of years ago, she achieved fame because on her blog, she was writing anonymously about her experiences at work.
Right.
You know, as she was working for an English
Right.
company in France, and you know, she was an expatriate, and somehow her boss found out about it, and she was fired. She brought suit, and that followed with Yahoo and CNN and this and that, and it was amazing. So I'm like, okay, if she can do it that way, although she did write a good blog, you never know. I've heard of people, you know, it seems like anybody who has a different voice, and sounds like you have a voice that could be very varied, because especially with all your experience, you never know from your blog. It could take off.
It'd be fun to do.
It's amazing.
I'm hoping that also the television miniseries of this book will help draw some attention.
So, yeah, starring Anne Hathaway. So, yeah, I'm kind of excited about that. Yeah. Well, we just sold rights to her a week and a half ago. We sold rights to her and Mark Gordon. So, yeah, we're really excited.
Channel is going to pick it up.
I don't think so. No, I know no details. So yeah, it's all we've just done the deal. So yeah, so it will be coming to a television near you with any luck. So we'll see.
Are you going to do audio or ebook version?
There already is an audiobook, and there already is a Kindle version. So you can already get the Kindle book, or I assume in any ebook format, and then you can already get the audio version. There's audio versions of my first book. I read my first book, so I did the audiobook for my first book, and with this one I thought it'd be better with actors, not least because there's a British actor, and I was not about to be made fun of by, my husband's people. Yeah, my husband, exactly. Yeah, so, anyway, anything else? Okay, I would be happy to sign books for you if you pick up a book. I know there's some at the cash register right there. I'm going to sit at this little table over here and sign your books. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ms. Steil. We also, as Ms. Steil says, we have her first book, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky. That's for sale as well at the counter. And this might be your last chance to get a first edition of this with the success we expect from the TV series and this book as well. This might be your last chance. So if you're still watching online, give us a call. We'll get one signed. We'll ship it to you. Everybody here is required to buy 5 copies each, so they're right behind the counter up there. Thank you so much for coming. That's right. Makes a great gift.
So the next edition was
Thank you.